Good morning, students. Today's topic is Sulci and gyri of the cerebral hemisphere. There are three surfaces: supralateral surface, medial surface, and inferior surface. First, we see about the sulci and gyri on the supralateral surface. First, we see the sulci present on the frontal lobe. The prefrontal sulcus or precentral sulcus. It is often broken into two or three parts, runs downwards and forwards parallel and little anterior to the central sulcus. The area between the central and precentral sulci is called precentral gyrus. Anterior to the precentral sulcus, there are two sulci called superior and inferior frontal sulci, which run horizontally. These sulci divide the region of frontal lobe in front of precentral sulcus into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. The anterior and ascending rami of lateral sulcus divide the inferior frontal gyrus into three parts. The part below the anterior ramus is called pars orbitalis. The part between the anterior and ascending rami is pars triangularis, and the part posterior to the ascending ramus, the pars opercularis. The central sulcus is the main sulcus we discussed earlier. Now let us discuss about the sulci present on the parietal lobe. The postcentral sulcus. It runs downwards and forwards a little behind and parallel to the central sulcus. The area between these two sulci is called postcentral gyrus. The rest of the parietal lobe is divided into a superior and inferior parietal lobules by an intraparietal sulcus. Next we see about the sulci present on the temporal lobe. There are two sulci in this lobe that run parallel to the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. These are superior and inferior temporal sulci, and it divides the temporal lobe into superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyrus. The superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus presents two transverse temporal gyri. The anterior transverse temporal gyrus, also called Heschel's gyrus, which forms the primary auditory area of the cortex. The upturned ends of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, superior and inferior temporal sulcus, it extends into the inferior parietal lobule and divides into three parts: supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus, and arcus temporo-occipitalis. Next, coming to the sulci and gyri present on the occipital lobe. The lateral occipital sulcus, superior and inferior occipital gyrus, lunate sulcus, and calcarine sulcus. Next we see the sulci and gyri on the medial surface, cingulate sulcus. It is the most prominent sulcus. It forms a curved course about 1 cm above and parallel to the convex margin of the corpus callosum. Anteriorly it ends below the genu of corpus callosum. Posteriorly it turns upwards to reach the supromedial border of the hemisphere, a little behind the upper end of central sulcus. The area between the cingulate sulcus and corpus callosum is termed cingulate gyrus. Next we see about the callosal sulcus. It separates the cingulate gyrus from corpus callosum. The part of the medial surface between the cingulate sulcus and the supromedial border of the hemisphere is divided by a short offshoot sulcus ascending from the cingulate sulcus above the middle of the trunk of corpus callosum into two parts. A small part around the upper part of central sulcus, the paracentral lobule, and larger medial part, the medial frontal gyrus. The posterior part of the medial surface behind the paracentral lobule has two main sulci, the calcarine sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus. The calcarine sulcus we discussed earlier, and parieto-occipital sulcus also we discussed earlier. The triangular area between the posterior part of the calcarine sulcus, also called postcalcarine sulcus, and the parieto-occipital sulcus is called cuneus. The quadrangular area between the parieto-occipital sulcus and paracentral lobule is termed precuneus. A small sulcus present little above and parallel to the splenium is called suprasplenial sulcus. It separates the precuneus from the cingulate gyrus. The other gyri are paraterminal gyrus, paraolfactory gyrus, and anterior and posterior paraolfactory sulcus. The inferior surface, it is divided into orbital part and tentorial surface. The orbital surface, it present following sulci. Olfactory sulcus. It is a straight sulcus which runs antero-posteriorly close to the medial border of the orbital surface. It is called olfactory sulcus because it lodges the olfactory bulb and tract. The area medial to this sulcus is called gyrus rectus. The next sulcus is orbital sulcus. It is an irregular hush-shaped sulcus and divides the rest of the orbital surface into anterior, posterior, medial and lateral orbital gyri. Next, coming to the sulci present on the tentorial surface. The tentorial surface is marked by two major sulci that runs antero-posteriorly. The medial one is called collateral sulcus and the lateral one is called occipito-temporal sulcus. The occipito-temporal sulcus continues around the infrolateral margin with the inferior temporal gyrus. Posteriorly, the collateral sulcus is parallel to the calcarine sulcus, and here the area between these two sulci is termed lingual gyrus. Anteriorly, the lingual gyrus is continuous with the parahippocampal gyrus. Anterior end of parahippocampal gyrus hooks sharply backwards and is limited laterally by a short rhinal sulcus. This hook-like anterior end of parahippocampal gyrus is called uncus. Posteriorly, the parahippocampal gyrus is continuous with the cingulate gyrus through the isthmus. The area between the occipito-temporal sulcus laterally and the collateral and rhinal sulci medially is known as medial occipito-temporal gyrus. The area lateral to the occipito-temporal sulcus is termed lateral occipito-temporal gyrus. This gyrus continues around the infrolateral margin of the hemisphere with the inferior temporal gyrus. So far we finished the sulci and gyri of the supralateral surface, medial surface and inferior surface. Thank you.